Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 3, The Original Black Mother. It is possible that the religious ideas of ancient Crete and Egypt originated in Black Africa. During 7000 to 6000 BC, the Sahara was a rich and fertile land, and a great civilization flourished there. Images of the horned goddess, who became Isis of Egypt, have been found in caves on a now inaccessible plateau in the center of what is now the Sahara Desert. When the earlier fertile land dried out, probably as a result of climatic change, the people spread out from the center, and wherever they settled, they brought with them the religion of the Black Goddess, the Great Mother of Africa. Great importance has always been given to the Queen Mother across the continent of Africa. The original Black Goddess was regarded as bisexual. The instrument of her own fertility, she was the ancient witch who carried a snake in her belly. Africans worshipped her in many manifestations. The creator of the gods of Dahomey, for example, was Mau Lisa, imaged as a serpent. Mau Lisa was both female and male, self-fertilizing, seen as the earth and the rainbow. Africans believe that the earth is ultimately more powerful than the sky and its gods. The sky can withhold rain, but earth is the source of the life force itself. The Gaia hypothesis of the modern environmental science confirms this ancient concept. The sky, with all its dramatic life-giving movement, is in fact created by the earth. The envelope of air and moisture surrounding us is really the earth's breathing. As in the ancient African beliefs, the sky gods are creation of the Mother Earth. She breathes them out and can breathe them back in again. Great work needs to be done in the study of indigenous African mythologies and religious beliefs, especially in linking these with the development of other world religions. For just as physical humankind probably began in Africa, so no doubt did our concepts and images of the sacred originate there. One Black historian who has investigated the African origins of the Egyptian, Mediterranean, and Near Eastern religions, including Christianity, is John J. Jackson. Through his 1972 work on the African origins of the world culture, is titled Man, God, and Civilization. Jackson fully acknowledges the matriarchal origins and influences of African societies. He quotes Lewis H. Morgan, Sir James G. Fraser, and Robert Briffault, and points out that their investigations of early group marriage and also of the primacy of lunar-based religions throughout the world are confirmed by early African matrifocal cultures. Not only the royal families of Egypt were matriarchal, but also the common people. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, circa 100 BC, wrote of the Egyptians, among private citizens, the husband, by terms of the marriage agreement, appertains to the wife and is stipulated between them that the man shall obey the woman in all things. As Jackson notes, these customs seem strange to the Greeks, but they were normal features of African societies. Jackson has devoted his life's work to pointing out that these ancient African societies were neither primitive nor underdeveloped, but formed the creative cradle of the world. For example, early technologies, remains of granite roads, and cultivation terraces are found throughout Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. And there are megalithic structures in West Africa. In the opinion of many anthropologists, including Franz Boas, iron smelting originated in Central Africa. The ancient people of Mashonaland in Zimbabwe were extensive miners and iron workers. Herodotus responded that iron tools were used in building the Egyptian pyramids, and these tools were mined and smelted in Africa. Another example is writing. Sir Wallace Budge, renowned Egyptian scholar, believed it was clear that Egyptian hieroglyphs derived from symbols used by native Africans on painted pots and boat banners. And we must add that the pottery painters and banner were women. In fact, the legendary Atlantis could have been West Africa. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus referred to the Western Ethiopians as Atlanteans. Trade between 6th century BC Phoenicians and Ethiopians living on an Atlantic island called Cerne, the Canary Islands, beyond the Pillars of Hercules is recorded. Leo Frobenius, the great 20th century archaeological explorer of Africa, was convinced that Atlantis had been located on the West African coast. In Yorubaland, he found remains of great palaces and statues and heard the Yoruba people recount legends of an ancient royal city and its palace and golden walls, which in the past sank between the waves. Yoruba, with its channeled network of lakes on the coast and reaches of the Niger, Yoruba, whose peculiarities are not adequately depicted in the Platonic account, this Yoruba, I assert, is Atlantis, home of Poseidon's territory, the sea god, by them named Olokun, and the lands of the people of whom Solon declared, they have even extended their lordship over Egypt and Tiran. Frobenius also saw links, physical and cultural, between the West African Yorubans and the culture of the Mayans in Central America. In Africa and the discovery of the Americas, Harvard professor Leo Weiner also traced this African Mayan connection, finding documented evidence that in pre-Columbian times, West African mariners and traders made over 50 voyages across the Atlantic to Central America. This connection would explain the early Olmec statuary found in the Veracruz region of Mexico, with its clearly Negroid features, and also the legend that Mayan glyphs were originated by the Olmecs. In connection with ancient West African mariners, it's also interesting to note that according to Irish historical legends, the Celtic islands was invaded and dominated for a time by sea rovers from northwest Africa called Fomorians. And on the other side of Europe, in India, evidence shows that the early inhabitants of India, the Dravidians, were Black Africans with Ethiopoid features. These Dravidians were Black Africans. These Dravidians founded the African civilization in the Indus Valley, with large cities, two-story brick houses, bathrooms with drains leading to brick sewers under the streets. The Dravidians were extremely skilled in iron technology. A Dravidian-made column of welded iron in a temple court in Delhi has stood for over 4,000 years without showing any rust. The renowned Damascus blades were made of this Dravidian iron. And once again, the pictographic script of 200 signs used by these 4th century BC Dravidians is almost identical to that found carved in the ruins of Easter Island, 2,000 miles west of Chile in the Pacific Ocean. All this far-flung evidence supports the probability that the ancient Africans were global mariners, traders, and settlers, both sailing west and east, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and spreading their advanced culture everywhere like seeds. And we must remember that this was a matriarchal culture. What all of these scholars of Africa and their data are telling us is that human development does not proceed in a straight line, from the primitive to the advanced. Nothing in nature proceeds in straight lines, but in circles, and human cultures too, like individual human beings go through cycles of development and regression. Empires do rise and fall, and the cultures that now appear primitive or never developed could well be sitting on the rubble of a past civilization once built by their ancestors, once flourishing, and then disintegrating under the multitude of pressures. This point is important for women investigating the past experiences of matriarchies, as well as for students of ancient African glories, whereby the same patterns applied to both. The contemporary Western world, ruled by an essentially white patriarchal elite, sees itself as the peak of human development. In its linear view, all past cultures were by nature inferior, simply because they came in earlier time and existed mainly not on their own right or in their own terms, but as a mere step on a grand stairway leading to the supreme white Western maledom. This linear development process is rarely questioned, no more than white male dominance is questioned. In the official view, it just comes from God or derives from Newton and the internal combustion engine. Confronted with evidence from archaeology, anthropology, mythology, strange dreams of the existence of past cultures, whether of Black Africans or Central American Mayas, or of Mediterranean matriarchies, for example, in Anatolia, Crete, Malta, Etruria, the historical tendency of white patriarchy has been absolutely to deny these early cultures and mock their evidence, or if they can't be denied, to treat them with chauvinistic contempt as some form of lavish barbarism. And the detractors quickly rush to point out that these early cultures, despite their aesthetic and spiritual qualities, were limited in technology, i.e. didn't have smog or home computers, or practiced human sacrifice, as though 20th century Western civilizations don't. And some other stigma of inferiority, which always adds up to saying they weren't us. No, they weren't, but they were viable cultures within their own terms. And because they were earlier in time, most of the arts, crafts, technologies, and religious insights we boast about were invented by them. When historians like John G. Jackson point out that many contemporary African village people live among the ruins of ancient graded roads, farm terraces, iron smelters, and megalithic monuments, which they no longer use or would not even know how to construct, they are referring to a phenomenon known as cultural regression. People can go backward in cultural and intellectual development as well as forward. Backward or forward, the movement is always along a spiral, not a straight line. Many factors can be responsible for such regression, including climate change, environmental damage from new technologies, i.e. cattle grazing helps create deserts, and internal cultural change. By all accounts, the major cause of cultural regression during the past 2,000 years has been political invasion and the cultural colonialism that follows. These invaders tried to destroy existing social norms by force and punitive colonial practices and attempt to impose their own cultural and religious patterns on the conquered. Culture is a people's own vision of themselves in relation to the world, created by themselves through a blood continuity of time and space. Political invasion via cultural colonialism weakens the creative will of the conquered by destroying the people's coherent vision of themselves. Guns, police, and the invader's law help this process, but the imposition of alien cultural symbols and religious ideas are the most effective tools in the long run for obliterating or distorting a people's self-image, because they're aimed at the most intimate parts of human being, sex and the spirit. By the time European and Arabic slave traders and colonial invaders reached Africa, that continent's great period of cultural development and extension had peaked. But the matriarchal social patterns, at least along the West Coast, were still intact, and the people still worshiped Black goddesses with bisexual powers and still participated in the cyclic processes of the Mother Earth as a sacred year cycle ritual. And it was those matrifocal social and kinship patterns and these goddesses-oriented spiritual participations that the colonialist invaders had to break in order to impose imperialist domination and exploitive slavery on the people. Whether Islam or Christianity impinged on the lives of Africans, it was introduced by the invaders, and those interests it was to detach the local inhabitants from the dependency of the rules of behavior demanded by agricultural and seasonal change. This pattern, the paradigm of patriarchal imperialism, we find repeated again and again throughout the world. In Africa, in Asia, in South and North America, what many people don't realize is that the same pattern was successfully imposed by Imperial Rome on its colony, Europe, at the beginning of the Christian era, a process we will investigate in part 4. To break up the natural, ancient, maternal kinship groupings and the sacred life patterns they followed, for the purpose of robbing the native people of their land, stealing the earth's raw resources, and exploiting human labor, The colonial armies sent the missionaries in to introduce abstract and alien concepts of Father Right and Father God, who was an enemy of the Great Mother. Christian missionaries preaching of the Heavenly Father and Son, and Muslims carrying the message of Allah and his Prophet Muhammad performed the same colonizing functions. They found the mother's people who were alive and well within the holistic now, and they denounced these people's ways and redefined them as backwards children of a distant, aloof, paternalistic power. All exploitation follows quite easily and self-righteously from such a redefinition. Colonialist powers really convinced themselves that they were doing their victims a favor, lifting them up from Mother Earth through whips, degradations, imprisonments, hunger, and slaughter, so they can glimpse through the tears of a far-off shining palace, the abode of the Heavenly Father, exploiting the home country. Imperialist colonialism always sees itself officially as an instrument of spiritual enlightenment. What this means in practice is that the mother, the people's blood identity, is denounced in the name of some superior father who always happens to live somewhere else. Because in maternal cultures, the father is a social rather than a biological role. And because this father role is defined in terms of its relation to the mother, this enforced redefinition brutally attempts to pull the ontological rug out from under all basic social relationships and the emotions that surround them. We must consider the effects of this. In some matrifocal cultures, such as the pre-Aryan Toda people of India, who practice polyandry, a woman will choose one among her many husbands to be a social father for her child. The more common practice is for the mother's brother to act as the social father. In these arrangements, the man acting as father must win the child's affection and respect. He cannot expect it as his right. He protects and cherishes the children, among some people receiving them into his arms when they are born, but they are not his in the sense that he is seen to have to share in their physical procreation. Among the pre-literate people, as among the ancient Paleolithic and Neolithic peoples, the man's role in procreation is seen as one of opening the womb. But it is believed that children are placed in the mother's womb by spirits, perhaps the returning spirits of dead kin. The man cannot relate to children as his property, in other words. They come from the mother, through the mother, and belong to the spirit world. There are fewer emotional conflicts in such cultures. The neurosis-producing, ego-festering hothouse atmosphere of the Victorian-type nuclear family is entirely avoided. After spending early childhood close to the mother's body, the young child then moves into the group's life, guided by the social father. The child belongs to the whole people and feels this belonging because he does not relate egotistically or possessively to the children. The social father is much better prepared to let his own nurturing talents develop truly. There is no question of property right, personal ambition, economic responsibility, sexual jealousy, or social status involved in his relationship to women and children. These cultures are not perfect, but the notorious soap opera of Western domestic life is avoided. Most of all, these matrifocal cultures have a webwork of non-possessive intergroup relationships, which supports a growing being through every phase and crisis of unfolding life. Colonialism tries to rip this network apart with artillery fire of patriarchal concepts of women's inferiority, of misogynistic and anti-sex morality, of possessive fatherhood, of competitive greed and alienated individualism, and of women, children, and land existing as the property of dominant males. A major rip involves splitting the human spirit away from the Mother Earth and her cyclic processes and forcibly reattaching this surrendered spirit to the sky, i.e. to some aloof and abstract source of dominance and power. A result of all of this is the deconstruction of a people's blood memory, its past identity, especially since colonized people tend to keep oral histories and patriarchy insists that only written down history is real. As Frantz Fanon says in The Wretched of the Earth, Colonialism is not simply content to impose its rule upon the present and the future of a dominated country. Colonialism is not satisfied merely with holding a people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content. By a kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of an oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. This work of devaluing pre-colonial history takes on a dialectic significance today. Colonialism is a form of vampirism that empowers and bloats the self-image of the colonizing empire by draining the life energies of the colonized people. Just enough blood is left to allow the colonial subject to perform a day's work for the objective empire. And these drained energies are not only of the present and future, but of the past memory itself, the continuity and identity of a people, and each individual who is colonized. No one should recognize this process better than women, for the female sex has functioned as a colony of organized patriarchal power for several thousand years now. Our brains have been emptied of all memory of our own cultural history, and the colonizing power systematically denies such a history ever existed. The colonizing power mocks our attempts to rediscover and celebrate our ancient matriarchies as reality. In the past, women have had to accept this enforced female amnesia as normal, and many contemporary women continue to believe the female sex has always existed and ab eterno as an auxiliary to a male-dominated world order. But we continue to dig in the ruins, seeking the energy of memory, believing that the reconstruction of women's ancient history has a revolutionary potential equal to that of any political movement today. One interesting fact in the reconstruction of both African history specifically and the ancient matriarchies generally is that there was a great explosion of scholarly interest in these subjects between the two world wars. Between 1920 and the mid-1930s, Helen Diner, Robert Briffault, Margaret Murray, and Jessie Weston were passionately digging up evidence of women's ancient cultures and religion, building on Jane Ellen Harrison's great work in the 1910s. During this same period, W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson, Leo Wiener, and the German Eugen George, among others, were exploring Black African history, building on the 1913 published work of Freud and the work of Joseph McCabe, who explored pre-Christian world history, including ancient African history from 1917 to 1935. Because ancient women's cultures existed everywhere, including Africa, and because Africa was originally matriarchal, there was a great deal of overlap in some of these studies, with most students reaching the same conclusion. Women, and furthermore, dark women, were the originators of most of what we know as human culture. With the eruption of World War II, these studies were cut off, and they were never picked up again, at least in the mainstream academic world. Since the 1950s, all research into women's past history, as well as into Black African history, has been initiated and carried out by highly motivated independent women and Black researchers functioning outside the academic establishment and in an atmosphere of subversive investigation. And in our Sub Rosa research, we have found these great pioneering works of the 1920s and 1930s consigned to the academic dustbins as eccentric and non-reputable histories. What was the devastating effect of World War II on these earlier studies? Apparently, ruptured alignment of Hitler and Nazism with paganism has had long-lasting results. They are still equated in many minds, especially the United States. Pagan remains a code word for everything evil, brutal, and willfully destructive, i.e. code word for Nazism, seen as a deliberate revival of the pre-Christian, orgiastic, and bloodthirsty Teutonic spirit. This equation occurs despite William Reach's clear and irrefutable analysis of German Nazism as a predictable eruption of puritanical, patriarchal culture. People who indulged in 500 years of inquisition, led by both Catholic and Protestant churchmen, jurists, and local magistrates, erupted again 2 centuries later in the Nazism of the 1930s. As we will show later, the European Inquisition and the German Nazism were based on the same patriarchal principles and used the same hysterical scapegoating and mass manipulation techniques, i.e., German Nazism as an expression of European Christian development, and cannot, in any historic sense, be blamed on pre-Christian paganism. Nevertheless, the equation has occurred, and this combined with Western sexism and racism, with their chronic fears of the dark and contaminating female, and the lurking bestial jungle forces, has created an official academic as well as public hostility towards any serious investigation of the pagan, i.e., the non-Christian, the non-white, the non-good. This hostility has been the excuse, if not the motivation, for a general refusal to recognize the importance of research into both ancient African cultures and ancient matriarchies. The pagan, the female, and the dark are still interpreted as attributes of the devil, and the desire of too many people is still to push them out of sight and out of mind. In one area alone, Westerners allow themselves to explore the material, to explore the pagan, dark, and the female, and to admit its familiarity, its intimate familiarity as the stuff of dreams. This is the area of psychoanalytical and particularly Jungian study. Erich Neumann, especially in The Great Mother, an analysis of the archetype, has gathered together powerful statues, paintings, and other icons of the great goddess as she was worshipped for thousands of years worldwide, and attempted to analyze the meaning of her many manifestations as good mother, terrible mother, white and black mother, lady of the beasts and plants, and so forth. To avoid the controversial existence of the real matriarchies, Neumann and other Jungians say that it's not relevant whether a belief in the goddess arises out of a society shaped by women or men. But they clearly assume the beliefs, as well as these icons, were shaped by men. The Great Mother exists for them as an archetype only, as the classic mental object of the male mind struggling to develop and understand itself. The real historical existence of real matriarchies in which women created goddess symbols and images out of their own female experience, worshipped by women and men alike, this interpretation would be revolutionary. And Jungians go out of their way to avoid politics. Their studies concentrate exclusively on the individual in isolation, a solipsistic paradigm deriving from the privileged economic status of both the analyst and the client, focusing on the disconnected individual ego in the modern world. They cannot understand the political content of these ancient myths, their economic and social backgrounds, and the female communal environment from which they emerged. Also, using without question the 19th century developmental models of inevitable and linear progress, Jungians theorized that mother goddess religions, if they existed only near the temporal origins of human culture. Therefore, they must express only the infancy of the race or the individual psyche. Psychoanalytical arrogance corresponds to Christianity's theology view of all pagan religions as spiritually underdeveloped, by positing mother goddess archetypes as infantile or as subconscious material. While Jungians say that the unconscious belongs to the realm of the mother, they are right. But they do not draw the enormous socio-political conclusions from this. Contemporary man is possessed by powers that are beyond his control. His gods and demons have not disappeared at all. They've merely got new names. They keep him on the run with restlessness, vague apprehensions, psychological complications, and insatiable need for pills, alcohol, tobacco, food, and above all, a large array of neuroses. Modern sickness is that of disconnection. The ego, unable to feel in organic parts of the world, except via chemical and popular culture addictions. But when the healers, the physicians of mind and body, do not know themselves, what is it that we need to be connected to? How can they solve the syndrome of disconnection? When the ego lets itself go, sinks down into the oceanic all oneness of the beginning and its peace, shrinks, they call this regression. They have virtually defined mature mindedness as a state of all permanent alienation, the I chronically differentiated from the all. And this amounts to the mature mind is the male mind rejecting his mother. Within Western culture, whenever the doors of perception open ever so little to let us catch a glimpse of the cosmic mind within us, we are in danger of being locked up for psychiatric observation and given tranquilizers or other cures. The established patriarchal institutions all have a vested interest in keeping the individual mind disconnected from the experience of cosmic oneness, because this disconnection is patriarchy. The bulk of all patriarchal industries, drug, alcohol, entertainment, media, fashion, and cosmetics, pornography, the tourist business, polyester-suited politics, dive-in religious sermons, interstate freeway systems, you name it, exist and profit solely by selling momentary diversions to multitudes of quietly desperate people, seeking an aesthetic escape from pain, from the pain of personal alienation. What in ancient times was experienced as our superconsciousness, within which we perceive the I thou of the ego dissolving into cosmic being of oneness, and whereby we received understanding, wisdom transcending dualism, magic perception, and healing powers, is now wholly submerged within us and termed the unconscious. And the psychotherapeutic establishment, including Jungians, portray this unconscious as essentially a frightening and threatening realm, the dark jungle within, the place of orgiastic desires in cannibal land, the black and hairy forest full of beasties, i.e., the pagan, the female, the dark. A ring of terror is placed around the unconscious for patriarchal political reasons, to keep us in a permanent state of fear and distrust in regard to our own innermost beings, and vis-a-vis the vast cosmos. Patriarchy manipulates and profits from this chronic state of fear and alienation, and Western religious and social history can be read as one long attempt to repress the cosmic female by keeping this fearful alienation institutionally alive and intact. Students of mythology find that when the feminine principle is subjected to sustained attack, as it was from the medieval Christian authorities, it often quietly submerges. Under the water, where life begins, it swims through the subconscious of the dominant male society, occasionally bobbing to the surface to offer a glimpse of the rejected harmony. Patriarchal politics, religion, and psychotherapy are always there, militant and quick to tell us that the rejected harmony is childish, illusionary, crazy, blasphemous, or unpatriotic. And we should know by now its reasons for doing so. But a breakthrough in some very interesting clinical experience conducted between 1975 and 1979, a variety of female, male, and adolescent psychotherapy patients who received the subliminal message, "Mommy and I are one," flashed on a tachoscope screen, were much more successful and permanently successful at losing weight, stopping drinking and smoking, and overcoming emotional problems to improve reading skills. Then were patients receiving neutral to no subliminal messages. Designed by psychologist Lloyd Silverman of New York University and described in his book, The Search for Oneness, these studies show that successful overcoming problems, i.e. mature development, does not come from severing the early infantile sense of unity with the mother, but from reestablishing it. The holistic point of ancient women's religion was that to the mother is not one's personal maternal parent solely, but the entire community of women, the entire living earth, and beyond this, the entire surrounding and ongoing cosmic process. One could not be alienated because one is always within the process, as it is always within the self. Unless, of course, such knowledge is repressed from the outside by patriarchal conditioning. Truly, our very sanity is at stake with continuing patriarchy and the denial of the cosmic self, the goddess within us all, and us within her. The Great Mother was the projection of the self-experience of groups of highly aware and productive women who were the founders of much of the human culture. In this sense, the Great Mother was not simply a mental archetype, but a historical fact. Ancient icons, symbols, and myths cannot be understood if they are disembodied from this fact. They cannot be understood as mind trips alone, but must be seen in the context of ancient political realities. Robert Graves, Welsh poet, essayist, and historical novelist, was one of the few modern students of mythology who took these ancient female political realities seriously. In his two-volume work, The Greek Myths, Graves showed that the major theme of Greek myths was the gradual historical reduction of women from sacred beings to slaves. The dramatic core of Greek myth and drama is the actual transition circa 1300 BC from matriarchy to patriarchy and the Aegean and the repercussions of this transition on the psyches of Greek people. In The White Goddess, Graves traces the origins of the European Greek goddess with her connections with the world mythologies and world alphabets, always a goddess invention, and her attempted obliteration by the Roman Empire and the Christian religion. Many feminists dislike Graves' interpretation of the goddess as, occasionally at least, a white bitch, but Graves' main concern is to relate the goddess as a male poet and to rediscover European roots of goddess worship. It remains for women to interpret the goddess as woman, relating to women and only Black women. Oriental women and Native American women can completely rediscover and reanimate the original goddesses of Africa, Asia, and the Americas for us. It's the job of white Europeans and Americans, after all, to stop explaining to everyone else and to begin trying to understand ourselves and our own history. But when Graves shows in his exploration of the early Greek and European goddesses that the loss of our own mythic history is the loss of our socio-political history, he speaks to all of us. Probably the greatest student of ancient mythology as ancient female political history was Robert Briffault. An anthropologist, gynecologist, and Marxist, Briffault spent 10 concentrated years of his life, thereby ruining his health, researching and writing his enormous work. The Mothers, probably the most thorough collection of evidence for the early existence of matrifocal cultures and the great goddess religions throughout the world. The data Briffault collected is global, irrefutable. Once we read Briffault and Graves, we can never look at the Great Mother as an apolitical archetype, as some power image that exists in our minds only, but never in historical reality. Because the Great Mother was a historic reality, her psychological suppression must also be seen in historical terms, as a political suppression of an earlier female-oriented world order by a later male-dominated one. Throughout Europe, especially Eastern Europe, but also in Spain, France, and Italy, we can find Black Madonnas. People have local legends to explain the blackness of these Virgin Mary statues, including the indigenous idea that the icon is charred, the miraculous survivor of a terrible fire. Jungian interpreters would see the blackness as a subconscious reference to the dark side of something or other, the moon, no doubt. It's rarely speculated that a real historic blackness of the goddesses of Egypt and Africa is being recalled. But when we read Briffault and other researches into the early mythic history and see not only the Black African origins of the Great Mother, but the extent to which early matriarchal Africans traveled throughout the ancient world, spreading the Black goddess, her pyramid technologies, stone and clay arts, and hieroglyphic scripts everywhere, then it is easy to understand the existence of these Black Madonnas. They are not psychological symbols of the dark side of the Mother Christ, or not solely or originally. They are solid, iconic remains of the ancient time when the religion of the Black Goddess ruled Africa, and from thence, much of the rest of the world. Here's another. In The Adventure of Mankind, the German scholar Eugen George argued that the Atlanteans were Ethiopians, supreme in Africa and Asia, who also penetrated into southern Europe. It was only after thousands of years of battle that these Black Atlantean invaders were finally pushed out of Europe. But the genetic memory of Europeans still bears traces of this experience. George suggests that this ancient memory survives in the European dread of dragons, who are, after all, loved and celebrated everywhere else, throughout Asia, India, Africa, Mexico, Central America, and South America. For, as George points out, the dragon painted on the insignia of the kings was carried in the van of the Black armies. The dragon that represents dark earth energies to those converted to white sky god beliefs. The curled dragon with its tail in the mouth that represents the ancient female holism to all-conquering linear male. Such a dragon also historically was carried into Europe on the banners of the matriarchal Atlantean African invaders. The archetype is an archetype because it represents a past reality. Its power over us as internal image is so profound because it was once an experienced fact of the external world. Our history as a species is stored in our genes, and no matter how hard patriarchy tries to suppress our past matriarchal history, it keeps bobbing to the surface in worldwide archaeological ruins, icons, and myths, as in our dreams.